In the midnight hour of 23rd December 2023, as a merciless blizzard paralyzed the forgotten mining town of Blackridge, Montana, Eleanor Wright, 27-year-old nurse and former sign language interpreter, cradled her fever-ravaged 6-month-old daughter, while her desperate hands shaped lullabies her voice could no longer carry. The cabin walls shuddered against howling winds. Frost etched crystalline patterns across single-pane windows. The fire's dying embers cast grotesque shadows that seemed to breathe and watch. When the ancient wooden door splintered open against impossible cold, Eleanor performed the most desperate act of maternal protection ever witnessed in those mountains, offering her own lifeblood to the imposing figure whose obsidian eyes reflected centuries of darkness, if only he would save the infant who hadn't cried in days. Her fingertips still forming signs of pleading as crimson droplets fell upon pristine snow. This is the story of how death became passage between worlds separated by more than mere mortality. Subscribe now to discover whether a mother's ultimate sacrifice can thaw a heart frozen for 800 years. The tapered candle flickered, illuminating Eleanor's exhausted features as she traced gentle circles across her daughter's burning forehead. 6 days of fever, 6 days of watching helplessness consume her medical training. In Blackridge, Montana, winter meant complete isolation, the mountain pass impassable, phone lines severed, no way to reach help. "Hold on, Sophie," Eleanor whispered, her voice catching. "Just hold on, sweet girl." The cabin had belonged to her grandfather, a stubborn relic from an earlier time. Outside, snow accumulated in drifts taller than a man, erasing the world beyond her windows. Eleanor adjusted the handmade quilt around Sophie's tiny body. The baby's breathing had grown shallow, each inhalation a labored whisper against the howling wind. The infection had moved to her lungs despite the precious antibiotics Eleanor had rationed from her own emergency medical kit. As a hospice nurse, Eleanor had witnessed death countless times, had held strangers' hands as they crossed that final threshold. But this was different. This was Sophie, her miracle, her everything. "I won't let you go," she signed, her fingers forming the words against Sophie's chest. The habit of signing had persisted from her time at the Denver School for the Deaf. Though Sophie couldn't understand, the motions comforted Eleanor. The wind screamed down the chimney, sending sparks across the hearth. The storm had worsened beyond anything the weather service had predicted before communications failed. Eleanor's hands trembled as she measured the remaining liquid in the medicine bottle. 2 doses left, maybe enough to reduce Sophie's fever temporarily, but nothing that would touch the underlying infection ravaging her tiny body. "I should never have brought you here," she whispered, guilt crushing her chest as she administered the medicine with a dropper. "I thought we'd be safe. I thought we'd be free." The restraining order against Mark hadn't been enough. Her ex-husband's rage had only intensified after the divorce, his threats escalating until Eleanor had fled Denver with nothing but what would fit in her grandfather's ancient Jeep and a newborn who'd never know her father's violence. Blackridge had seemed perfect in its obscurity, a place to disappear until she could establish a new identity, a new beginning. Now isolation had become her enemy rather than her sanctuary. Sophie's eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Her once plump cheeks had hollowed, and her skin had taken on a translucent quality that terrified Eleanor more than the fever itself. Children deteriorated quickly. This fundamental truth from her medical training haunted her as she monitored Sophie's pulse, counting the 2 rapid beats beneath paper-thin skin. Outside, the wind abruptly died, creating a vacuum of silence. That's when she felt it, a pressure change that made her ears pop, an electric charge that raised the fine hairs on her arms. Something was coming. Eleanor clutched Sophie tighter against her chest as the first impact shook the door. Not wind, something solid and deliberate. A second blow followed, powerful enough to make the hinges groan. "Who's there?" Her voice sounded thin against the resumed howling of the storm. The third impact splintered ancient wood. The door burst inward in an explosion of ice crystals and frigid air, revealing a darkness deeper than the night beyond. Eleanor scrambled backward, cradling Sophie against her shoulder, her free hand fumbling behind her for anything that might serve as a weapon. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, impossibly tall and still, snow swirling around him like a living cloak. No human could have navigated the treacherous terrain in this weather. "Stay back," Eleanor warned. "I have nothing worth taking." The figure stepped forward, moving with unsettling fluidity. In the candle's light, she discerned features of inhuman perfection: alabaster skin over aristocratic bones, eyes like polished obsidian. He wore no coat despite the bitter cold, only a suit of midnight black. When he spoke, his voice resonated with an accent Eleanor couldn't place, ancient and cultured. "I am not here to take, Eleanor Wright. I am here to collect what was promised." The stranger knew her name. Impossible. "I've promised nothing to anyone," she said, edging toward the fireplace. "Not you, your grandfather, James Wright. He made a bargain 73 years ago to save his mining operation and the town, a firstborn child, in exchange for prosperity and protection." Eleanor's blood turned to ice in her veins. Her grandfather's stories, the ones she'd dismissed as the fairy tales of an old man seeking to entertain a lonely granddaughter. Tales of an ancient being who lived beneath the mountain, who had saved Blackridge when the silver mine collapsed during the Great Depression, who had extracted promises Eleanor had never believed were real. "You're lying," she whispered, though uncertainty had already taken root. The mine's miraculous reopening after the cave-in that should have bankrupted the operation. The town's inexplicable prosperity during years when similar communities withered and died. Her grandfather's insistence that Eleanor understand the importance of promises, of blood bonds, of debts that must be honored. "I do not lie, Eleanor Wright. I have waited patiently for 3 generations. Now I have come for what is mine." He extended one pale hand, elegant fingers expectant. "The child." No. The word escaped as barely more than a breath, but it contained all the fierce protection of a mother who had already sacrificed everything for her daughter. "She's dying, can't you see that? She needs a hospital, a medication. What she needs is beyond your mortal medicine." The stranger's expression remained impassive, but something ancient and terrible stirred behind his eyes. "I can save her. That was not part of the bargain, but I offer it freely. She will live, Eleanor Wright, though not as you might wish." Understanding crashed through Eleanor with the force of an avalanche. This creature, this being from her grandfather's darkest stories, intended to take Sophie away, to transform her into something inhuman, a life eternal. But at what cost? "You're him. The king beneath the mountain," Eleanor said. "King Aldrich, to those who still remember the old ways. Your grandfather knew me well." Sophie stirred against Eleanor's shoulder, a weak mewling sound escaping her parched lips. The tiny movement galvanized Eleanor, clarity cutting through her terror. Her daughter was dying. Minutes, perhaps hours, remained of her brief, precious life. And here stood a being who claimed the power to prevent it, at the unthinkable cost of surrendering her child to an existence Eleanor could scarcely comprehend. "If I refuse." She already knew the answer, but needed to hear it spoken aloud. "Then the child dies before dawn," King Aldrich stated with the dispassionate certainty of one who had witnessed countless mortal passings. "And the debt remains, Eleanor Wright. It will follow your bloodline until it is satisfied. Your children's children unto the last generation." Outside, the storm's fury intensified, as though nature itself responded to the tension within the cabin's walls. Snow piled against the broken door, a reminder that no help would come from the human world tonight. Eleanor moved slowly to the rocking chair, cradling Sophie against her chest one final time. Her daughter's breathing had grown more labored, skin taking on a bluish tinge that Eleanor recognized from her medical training as cyanosis, oxygen deprivation. Without intervention, Sophie would not survive until morning. "Will she remember me?" Eleanor asked, her voice cracking as she traced a finger along her daughter's perfect cheek. "Will she know she was loved?" Something shifted in Aldrich's expression. Not compassion precisely, but perhaps recognition of the sacrifice being contemplated. "Memory is complex in the transition, but she will know she was cherished, though she may not recall your face or name. This is the mercy I can offer." Eleanor pressed her lips to Sophie's forehead, memorizing the silk of her skin, the faint baby scent that persisted beneath the medicinal odors of illness. She had carried this child beneath her heart for 9 months, had endured 27 hours of labor to bring her into the world, had fled across state lines to protect her from a father's rage. The thought of surrendering her now, even to save her life, tore at Eleanor's soul with talons of unbearable grief. "There must be another way," she whispered, desperation edging her voice. "Something else I can offer. Anything." King Aldrich studied her with those fathomless eyes, ancient and calculating. "The debt must be paid, Eleanor Wright, but—" He hesitated, an uncharacteristic uncertainty crossing his features. "There is an alternative, though it has not been chosen in 8 centuries of bargains." Hope flared in Eleanor's chest, bright and painful. "Tell me, a substitution, a life freely given in place of the promised child." His gaze pierced her, seeing through flesh to the soul beneath. "Your life, Eleanor Wright, offered without reservation or regret. Your blood to sustain my kingdom through the coming century. Your service until the debt is fully discharged." "You want my blood?" Eleanor clutched Sophie tighter, confusion battling with the fragile hope taking root. "I require sustenance, as do my people. We have existed in symbiosis with Blackridge since its founding, protection and prosperity in exchange for the life energy that fuels our continued existence. 1 child per generation has maintained this balance." His tone remained matter-of-fact, as though discussing a business transaction rather than the consumption of human life. "But an adult, willingly sacrificed, would provide equivalent value." Understanding dawned, terrible and clear. This creature, this vampire king from her grandfather's supposedly fictional stories, offered to spare Sophie in exchange for Eleanor's life and blood. Not immediate death, but a slow draining over decades of servitude. The child would remain mine. Eleanor needed absolute clarity on this point. She would live with you until her 18th year. She would know you as mother, though she cannot know of our arrangement. King Aldrich's expression hardened. On her 18th birthday, she would come to me for 1 year of service in my court to honor the bargain that spared her life. After that, her fate would be her own. 1 year of service to repay a lifetime granted. The terms seemed almost reasonable, cast against the immediacy of Sophie's impending death. But Eleanor knew enough of bargains with supernatural entities to recognize the dangers of unspoken conditions. And she would remain human, unchanged, completely mortal, with all the frailties and wonders that entails. Outside, the wind changed direction, howling with renewed fury. Sophie's breathing grew more ragged, each inhalation a visible struggle against failing lungs. Time was running out. Eleanor rose from the rocking chair, decision crystallizing with the clarity that comes from absolute necessity. She laid Sophie gently on the quilt-covered sofa, arranging her tiny limbs with tender care. Then she turned to face the vampire king, shoulders squared despite the terror threatening to overwhelm her. "If I agree, you'll heal her immediately. Tonight." King Aldrich nodded once. "The child will awaken tomorrow with no trace of illness. Your bargain ensures her complete recovery." "How will it work? My sacrifice?" The word felt strange on Eleanor's tongue. 3 nights each month you will come to the passage beneath the old mine shaft. You will provide sustenance for my court. The process is not painless, but neither is it the savage attack depicted in your human fiction. His expression remained impassive. You will grow weaker over time, though not noticeably to human observers. Your lifespan will be shortened, perhaps 60 years rather than 80, but the child will live. 60 years. Still enough time to raise Sophie, to see her grow into adulthood, perhaps even to meet grandchildren. The alternative, watching her daughter die tonight, was unthinkable. "I need your oath," Eleanor said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "Swear that Sophie will be healed completely, that she'll remain human, that she'll stay with me until she's 18. A look of grudging respect crossed the vampire king's features. "You have learned caution from your grandfather's tales. Very well." He extended his hand, palm upward. "Blood seals our covenant, Eleanor Wright. 3 drops freely given to bind our agreement." Eleanor hesitated only briefly before retrieving a sewing needle from her mending basket. With deliberate movements, she pricked her finger, and allowed 3 crimson drops to fall into his waiting palm. The effect was immediate and terrifying. King Aldric's eyes flared crimson, his features momentarily transforming into something inhuman and predatory as he closed his fingers around her blood. Power surged through the cabin, making the candle flame dance wildly and sending the temperature plummeting until Eleanor could see her breath clouding before her. "So it is sworn," he intoned, voice resonating with supernatural force. "So it shall be." He moved to the sofa with that same unsettling fluidity, bending over Sophie's still form. Eleanor instinctively stepped forward, maternal protection overriding even her fear of this ancient being. King Aldric raised a hand, halting her approach. "The healing requires concentration," he said, not unkindly. "Stay back." Eleanor watched, heart pounding, as he placed one pale hand on Sophie's chest. He spoke words in a language Eleanor didn't recognize, something guttural and ancient that seemed to vibrate the very air. Sophie's body arched slightly, a soft glow emanating from beneath the vampire's palm, spreading through her tiny form like luminescent honey through water. Color returned to Sophie's cheeks in a rush, the bluish tinge receding as her breathing deepened and steadied. Before Eleanor's astonished eyes, the fever flush faded, replaced by the healthy pink of normal baby skin. Sophie's eyelids fluttered, then opened fully, clear, alert, free from the glassy disorientation of illness. When she smiled up at the strange figure bending over her, Eleanor nearly collapsed with relief. King Aldric straightened, his expression unreadable as he regarded the infant now reaching curiously for his finger. "It is done. The child is healed." Eleanor crossed the room in 3 desperate strides, gathering Sophie into her arms, feeling the healthy warmth of her skin, the strong, steady rhythm of her breathing. Tears flowed freely down Eleanor's cheeks as she pressed kisses to her daughter's face, her hair, her perfectly formed hands. Sophie squirmed and made a small sound of protest at the smothering affection, the first noise she had made in days. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered, the words utterly inadequate to express the gratitude overwhelming her. "Thank you." King Aldric inclined his head slightly, already moving toward the shattered door. "Remember our bargain, Eleanor, right? 3 nights each month, beginning with the next full moon. The old mining tunnel, where the silver vein meets the underground river." He paused, something almost human flickering across his features. "The child will thrive. This, I promise you." Then he was gone, leaving nothing but swirling snow and a cold wind to mark his passing. Eleanor stood motionless in the center of the cabin, cradling her miraculously healthy daughter, listening as the storm gradually resumed its natural rhythm without the supernatural intensity that had accompanied the Vampire King's presence. She had made a bargain with a creature of legend, had sacrificed decades of her life to save her daughter, had bound herself to 3 nights of bloodletting each month for the foreseeable future. Yet as Sophie reached up to touch her face, babbling happily as though she had never been ill, Eleanor knew she would make the same choice again, without hesitation. Any price was worth the miracle of her daughter's continued life. Tomorrow she would repair the door, would figure out how to explain Sophie's miraculous recovery, should they ever reconnect with civilization. She would plan for their future in Blackridge, a future now inextricably linked to the underground kingdom her grandfather had warned her about. Tonight, she would simply hold her daughter close, cherishing every breath, every heartbeat, every precious moment restored to them through a mother's ultimate sacrifice. The first full moon after Sophie's recovery rose over Blackridge like a baleful eye. Eleanor stood at her cabin window, watching moon shadows stretch across untouched drifts. Her hands trembled as she fastened her coat. "She'll be fine, Mrs. Peterson," Eleanor said. "She's been sleeping through the night consistently. I shouldn't be gone more than a few hours." Martha Peterson, 76 years old and the closest thing Blackridge had to a doctor, nodded without looking up from her knitting. "That child's recovery was nothing short of miraculous," she remarked. "Never seen anything like it." Eleanor swallowed hard, adjusting the woolen scarf around her neck. "Sometimes these childhood fevers break as quickly as they come on." Martha's non-committal response carried a weight of skepticism, though she didn't press further. In small towns like Blackridge, people learned when not to ask questions, a trait that had served Eleanor well since her arrival 6 months earlier. "You go on to your night shift, dear. Sophie and I will be just fine." The night shift was the explanation Eleanor had fabricated for her monthly absences, an emergency medical service she claimed operated out of the next town over. No one questioned why these shifts always coincided with the full moon, or why Eleanor returned looking pale and exhausted. In Blackridge, people minded their own business, especially during the harsh winter months when survival took precedence over curiosity. Eleanor bent to place a kiss on Sophie's forehead, where she slept peacefully in her handmade crib. The baby had flourished in the month since her miraculous healing, regaining lost weight and developing with the vigor of the perfectly healthy infant she now was. Each milestone, each smile, each coo, each tiny discovery reinforced Eleanor's conviction that her bargain had been necessary, no matter the personal cost. "I'll be back before dawn," she promised, both to Martha and to her sleeping daughter. The bitter cold stole Eleanor's breath as she stepped outside, the temperature well below zero even without the wind chill. The snow-packed road leading from her isolated cabin toward the abandoned mine reflected moonlight with an almost phosphorescent glow, creating just enough illumination to navigate without artificial light. Eleanor had made this journey twice during the previous month, reconnaissance missions to locate the entrance King Aldrich had described, to time the walk precisely, to prepare herself for tonight's reckoning. Her boots crunched through the crusty top layer of snow, each step requiring deliberate effort. Blackridge slept below, a cluster of lights nestled in the mountain valley like fallen stars. The town had never questioned her grandfather's bequest of the remote cabin, had welcomed Eleanor with the cautious acceptance they offered any newcomer who didn't disrupt their way of life. None of them suspected the ancient pact that bound their continued existence to the beings dwelling beneath the mountain. The abandoned silver mine loomed ahead, its weathered timbers and rusted equipment standing in stark silhouette against the moonlit snow. Warning signs had been posted around the perimeter: danger, unstable ground, no trespassing, but most were so faded by weather that their messages had become illegible. Few locals ventured here anyway. The mine held too many troubling memories, too many whispered stories about the men who had entered and never returned. Eleanor ducked beneath a fallen support beam, making her way to the mine entrance that had supposedly collapsed during the cave-in of 1933. According to official records, the main shaft had been deemed irrecoverable, forcing miners to create a new entrance farther along the mountainside. Yet her grandfather's journals told a different story, of passages that still existed beneath the apparent collapse, of a hidden entrance that appeared only to those who knew its location. "Southeast corner, where the old rail tracks disappear into the rubble," Eleanor murmured to herself, reciting the directions she had memorized from her grandfather's spidery handwriting. Third post from the left, marked with the symbol of the crown. The moonlight revealed what daylight had concealed during her previous explorations, a faint etching in the weathered wood, a crown with 7 points that might easily be dismissed as random damage by anyone not specifically seeking it. Eleanor pressed her palm against the marking, feeling the wood warm beneath her touch, despite the frigid air. The ground shifted beneath her feet, not violently but with deliberate purpose, as a section of what appeared to be collapsed rubble receded to reveal a narrow passage descending into darkness. A faint glow emanated from deep within, not the warm yellow of firelight, but a cooler blue-white illumination that reminded Eleanor of bioluminescent organisms she had once seen in a nature documentary. She hesitated at the threshold, fear momentarily overwhelming her determination. What waited below was the stuff of nightmares, creatures that fed on human blood, that existed in parasitic relationship with the town above. Beings that had waited patiently for generations to claim a child, promised in desperation. Sophie's face floated in Eleanor's mind, rosy-cheeked, vibrant, alive. The alternative to this descent was her daughter's grave. With that thought firmly anchored in her consciousness, Eleanor stepped into the passage, flinching slightly as the entrance sealed itself behind her. The temperature rose noticeably as she descended, the bitter mountain cold giving way to an ambient warmth that allowed her to loosen her scarf. The passage walls transformed gradually from rough-hewn stone to more finished surfaces, eventually becoming polished marble veined with what appeared to be silver. Sconces mounted at regular intervals housed the source of the strange illumination. Glass globes containing a shifting, cloud-like substance that cast enough light to navigate by without dispelling the shadows completely. After what seemed like an eternity of descent, the passage opened into a vast cavern. Rather than the damp, oppressive space she had imagined, she found herself at the edge of what could only be described as an underground city. Buildings of stone and metal rose from the cavern floor, with architecture of organic flowing lines rather than rigid angles, surfaces reflecting ethereal light. A figure detached from the shadows, a woman with copper-colored hair and eyes the blue-green of glacial ice. Like King Aldrich, she possessed the unnatural stillness of the vampires. "Eleanor Wright," she greeted. "I am Lilith, Seneschal to His Majesty's court. I have been instructed to escort you." Eleanor nodded stiffly, unable to formulate a proper response. The reality of her situation, standing before an actual vampire in an underground kingdom, had momentarily robbed her of speech. Lilith seemed to understand, her smile softening into something almost sympathetic. "The first descent is always disorienting. It becomes easier with familiarity." She gestured toward the largest structure in the center of the cavern city, a palace of silver and obsidian that gleamed in the strange light. "His Majesty awaits in the feeding chamber. We should not keep him waiting." Eleanor followed, hyper-aware of each heartbeat, each pulse of blood through her veins. These were creatures who could hear such things, who would perceive her fear through the accelerated rhythm of her circulatory system. She forced herself to breathe deeply, to focus on the wonders around her, rather than the terror threatening to overwhelm her rational mind. The streets of the underground city were populated with beings similar to Lilith and King Aldrich, ethereally beautiful, moving with that same unsettling fluidity, regarding Eleanor with expressions ranging from curiosity to hunger as she passed. Some appeared almost human, while others displayed more pronounced inhuman characteristics, eyes that reflected light like those of nocturnal predators, elongated canines visible when they spoke, skin so pale it bordered on translucent. "They will not harm you," Lilith assured her, noting Eleanor's tenseness. "You bear the king's mark. Your blood is reserved for the royal household alone." This was hardly reassuring, but Eleanor nodded regardless. "How many of you live down here?" 342 at present, Lilith answered without hesitation. "Our numbers have diminished over the centuries as human populations in this region decreased. We maintain a careful balance, never taking more than can be sustained." Like responsible farmers managing their livestock, Eleanor couldn't help but observe, bitterness edging her voice. Lilith's expression remained unperturbed. A crude but not entirely inaccurate analogy, though we prefer to think of it as symbiosis rather than husbandry. Your kind receives protection and prosperity. We receive sustenance. It has been thus since the first human settlements in these mountains. They had reached the palace entrance. Massive doors of polished obsidian inlaid with silver in patterns that seemed to shift and move when viewed from different angles. Guards stood at attention, their stillness so complete they might have been statues until they inclined their heads in acknowledgement of Lilith's approach. The interior of the palace maintained the organic architectural style Eleanor had observed throughout the cavern city, though executed on a grander scale. Ceilings soared to heights that shouldn't have been possible underground. Corridors curved gracefully rather than following straight lines. Light seemed to emanate from the very walls, casting no shadows. Lilith led her through a labyrinth of passages that Eleanor suspected were designed to disorient visitors, finally stopping before a set of double doors carved from some pale wood Eleanor didn't recognize. "The feeding chamber," Lilith announced, resting her hand on an intricate door handle. "His Majesty has requested privacy for your first donation. This is unusual." Her glacial eyes studied Eleanor with renewed interest. "He must find you particularly intriguing." Before Eleanor could respond to this unsettling observation, Lilith opened the door and gestured for her to enter. The feeding chamber proved less ominous than its name suggested. A circular room with comfortable furnishings, arranged around a central fireplace where actual flames danced, casting warm light to complement the cooler illumination from the walls. Tapestries depicting mountain landscapes hung between floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, filled with volumes, whose spines displayed writing in languages Eleanor didn't recognize. King Aldric stood with his back to the door examining one such volume. He wore simpler attire than during his visit to Eleanor's cabin. A shirt of dark blue silk tucked into black trousers, no shoes despite the stone floor. The effect was oddly humanizing, making him seem more approachable despite the power that radiated from his very presence. "Leave us," he instructed without turning, and Eleanor heard the door close softly as Lilith departed. Only when they were alone did he face her, those obsidian eyes assessing her with the same clinical detachment one might direct toward a laboratory specimen. "You came." It wasn't quite a question, though something in his tone suggested he had harbored some doubt. "I made a promise," Eleanor replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Sophie's life for my blood. I honor my agreements." A hint of approval flickered across his features. "A trait seemingly hereditary in your family. Your grandfather never missed his appointed deliveries of silver, even during the most desperate years of the Depression." He gestured toward a high-backed chair positioned near the fire. "Please sit. The process is less taxing when the donor is comfortable." Eleanor perched on the edge of the indicated seat, too tense to relax into its cushioned embrace. "How does this work exactly?" "Directly from the source is most efficient." King Aldric moved to stand before her, his height more imposing from her seated position. "The wrist is traditional for formal donations, less intimate than the neck, more accessible than other pulse points. Will it hurt?" Eleanor hated how vulnerable the question made her sound, but needed preparation for what was to come. "Initially, yes. Our saliva contains a mild analgesic that reduces discomfort after the first few moments." His clinical tone made the conversation feel almost medical, a consultation rather than the prelude to blood extraction. "The first donation is always the most difficult. Your body will adapt with repetition." Eleanor steeled herself, extending her left arm with palm upward, exposing the blue veins visible beneath her pale skin. "Let's get it over with, then." King Aldric's eyebrows rose slightly at her directness. "Most donors require more reassurance." "Would platitudes make this easier for either of us?" Eleanor challenged, surprising herself with her boldness. "I'm here because I have no choice. You're feeding on me because it's your nature. Let's not pretend this is anything but what it is." A sound escaped him that might almost have been a chuckle. Refreshingly pragmatic. He took her offered wrist in a grip that was firm but not painful, his skin cool but not cold against hers. "Try to relax. Tension makes the vessels constrict." Eleanor forced her muscles to loosen, employing the same breathing techniques she had taught anxious patients before medical procedures. She fixed her gaze on the dancing flames in the fireplace, deliberately avoiding watching as King Aldric lowered his head toward her exposed wrist. The initial pain was sharp and immediate, twin points of fire that made her gasp. After those first terrible seconds, the promised numbness spread, replacing pain with an odd floating sensation. Eleanor felt her heartbeat slow, her awareness narrowing to the rhythmic pull of extraction. Through it all, she maintained her focus on the fireplace, thinking of Sophie, of the healthy pink flush that had returned to her cheeks. This sacrifice was the price of that miracle. When King Aldric finally withdrew, the cessation of pressure was almost as shocking as its initiation had been. Eleanor blinked rapidly, forcing her vision to refocus as he pressed a cloth against the puncture wounds. "Hold this," he instructed, guiding her right hand to maintain pressure. "The bleeding will stop momentarily." Eleanor complied automatically, her medical training asserting itself despite her lightheadedness. "How much did you take?" "Less than a standard blood donation," he answered, moving to a sideboard where a crystal decanter and glasses waited. "Though the effect is more pronounced due to the method of extraction." He poured a ruby-colored liquid into one of the glasses and brought it to her. "Drink this. It will help restore your equilibrium." Eleanor accepted the glass cautiously, sniffing its contents. "What is it?" "Pomegranate juice, enhanced with iron supplements and glucose." His expression suggested amusement at her suspicion. "I have no need to drug you, Eleanor Wright. Our arrangement ensures your willing return." The juice was tart and sweet, helping with her dizziness. "You'll experience fatigue for approximately 24 hours, King Aldric informed her. "Increased thirst, possibly mild headaches. Nothing that cannot be managed with rest and hydration." Eleanor nodded, still processing the surreal nature of their interaction, this clinical aftercare following an act that belonged in horror films rather than reality. "Is that all for tonight?" "For tonight, yes. 3 nights each month, as agreed." He studied her with that same unsettling intensity. "You handled the process remarkably well for a first donation. Most humans find it more distressing." "I'm a nurse," Eleanor replied, as though this explained everything. In some ways it did. Her familiarity with blood and pain, her ability to compartmentalize physical discomfort, her focus on the outcome rather than the process. Indeed. He seemed to consider this information, filing it away for future reference. A valuable skill set. "Perhaps there are ways your training might serve my court beyond our current arrangement." Alarm flashed through Eleanor. "Our bargain was specific, 3 nights each month, nothing more." "Calm yourself. I do not propose altering our agreement without consent." King Aldric's tone held no offense at her sharp response, merely an observation that talents should not be wasted. "We have limited access to medical knowledge here." Eleanor relaxed marginally, though wariness remained. Bargains with supernatural beings were dangerous precisely because of such incremental expansions. Give an inch, lose a mile. Her grandfather's journals had been explicit on this point. "If I were to consider additional services, there would be additional compensation," she stated, surprising herself again with her boldness. "Reduced feeding frequency, perhaps?" King Aldric's expression shifted to one of genuine interest. "You negotiate rather than refuse outright." "Fascinating." He leaned forward slightly. "Your grandfather attempted no such discussions. He provided the agreed-upon silver and departed immediately, interaction limited to the bare minimum required." "My grandfather wasn't raising a child in Blackridge," Eleanor pointed out. "My circumstances necessitate different considerations." "Indeed they do." He rose with that unnerving, fluid grace, moving to stand before the fire. "We will revisit this possibility at a later date. For tonight our business is concluded." He gestured toward the door, which opened seemingly of its own accord. "Lilith will escort you back to the surface." Eleanor stood carefully, testing her stability before attempting to walk. The weakness was noticeable but manageable, similar to how she'd felt after donating blood during nursing school. "Until next month, then." King Aldric inclined his head in acknowledgement, already turning his attention back to the book he had been examining when she arrived. The dismissal was clear. She had fulfilled her purpose for the evening and was no longer of immediate interest. As Eleanor followed Lilith through the labyrinthine palace corridors, she reflected on the strangeness of her new reality. She had just allowed a vampire king to feed on her blood, had negotiated potential terms for expanded services, was walking through an underground city that shouldn't exist according to every law of physics and geology. She understood. Yet compared to watching Sophie struggle for breath as infection ravaged her tiny body, this strange new normal seemed a manageable price to pay. 1 night down, decades of nights to go. She would endure. For Sophie, she would endure anything. Spring arrived late to the mountains, the last stubborn snowdrifts clinging to north-facing slopes well into April. Eleanor watched from her cabin window as Sophie took tentative steps across new grass, squatting periodically to examine pebbles, insects, and wildflowers with the intense concentration only toddlers can sustain. At 16 months old, Sophie had blossomed into a curious, determined child whose boundless energy belied the grave illness that had nearly claimed her life. "Don't put that in your mouth, sweetheart," Eleanor called, hurrying outside as Sophie discovered a particularly interesting beetle. The morning sun felt glorious against her skin after the long, dark winter, warmth that penetrated deeper than the persistent chill that had become her constant companion since beginning her monthly donations. 6 feedings had occurred since that first descent. Each left Eleanor progressively more fatigued as cumulative blood loss took its toll. She had learned to schedule the donations for Friday evenings, giving herself the weekend to recover before returning to her part-time position at Blackridge's small medical clinic on Mondays. The job had been unexpected. An offer from Martha Peterson, after Eleanor had successfully treated a case of strep throat in the Peterson grandchild, when the nearest hospital had been inaccessible due to a rockslide. The clinic operated only 3 days a week, serving basic medical needs while referring more complex cases to larger facilities in neighboring towns. The position provided legitimate income, integration into the community, and a purpose beyond caring for Sophie and fulfilling her supernatural obligation. "Mama, look!" Sophie held up a dandelion gone to seed, its white fluff pristine against her dirt-smudged fingers. "It's beautiful," Eleanor agreed, kneeling beside her daughter. "Do you want to make a wish?" Sophie's brow furrowed in concentration, her rosebud mouth pursing seriously. Then she blew with all her might, sending the tiny parachutes spiraling into the morning breeze. Her delighted laughter echoed across the mountainside, pure joy that made Eleanor's heart constrict with love and gratitude. These were the moments that validated her choice. Sophie's laughter, her discoveries, her existence in the world. Whatever personal cost Eleanor bore, it was worth this miracle. The clinic bell chimed cheerfully as Eleanor entered, balancing Sophie on her hip while managing a diaper bag with her free hand. Martha looked up from her reception desk, her perpetual knitting needles pausing mid-stitch. "There's my favorite little patient," she cooed, setting aside her work to hold her arms out for Sophie, who went willingly to the older woman. "I've got her, dear. Dr. Callahan called. Said he's bringing in a patient from the logging camp, bad gash that needs stitching. Asked if you'd assist." Eleanor nodded, depositing the diaper bag beside Martha's desk. "When do they arrive?" "Any minute. Accident happened about an hour ago up near the North Ridge." Martha bounced Sophie gently, already reaching for the picture books kept specifically for the toddler's visits. "We'll be fine here, won't we, sweet pea?" Eleanor ducked into the small examination room to prepare suture materials, grateful that the logging accident had occurred on a Monday, rather than the weekend immediately following a feeding. Her energy levels had largely recovered, though she noticed her stamina wasn't what it had been before beginning donations. Small tasks winded her more easily. She required more sleep than previously. Bruises lingered longer when she bumped against furniture. The clinic door opened again, voices carrying from the reception area. Dr. Callahan's reassuring baritone, another man's pain-filled responses, Martha's soothing commentary. Eleanor finished laying out the instruments on a sterile tray, pulling on latex gloves as the doctor ushered in a man Eleanor recognized as one of the newer workers at the sustainable logging operation that had replaced the more aggressive clear-cutting practices of previous decades. "Nurse Wright, this is Ben Sullivan," Dr. Callahan introduced as he helped the man onto the examination table. Chainsaw kicked back, caught him across the forearm. "I've applied pressure, but it's going to need a good cleaning and stitches." Eleanor nodded professionally, helping to position the injured arm for better access. The wound was serious but clean, a straight slice approximately 4 inches long that had nearly reached bone, but appeared to have missed major blood vessels and tendons. "You're lucky," she told the grimacing logger as she began irrigating the wound with saline solution. "Another inch to the left and you'd be looking at surgery in Missoula." "Don't feel particularly lucky," Ben muttered, though his expression suggested appreciation for her straightforward assessment. "Nurse Wright has excellent suturing technique," Dr. Callahan commented as he prepared a local anesthetic. "Steadier hands than mine these days. You're in good care." Eleanor smiled at the compliment, focusing on the task at hand as the doctor administered lidocaine around the wound edges. The familiar routine of wound care centered her, cleaning, preparing, stitching with careful precision to minimize scarring. This was healing work, the antithesis of the blood donations that drained her vitality each month. Here she restored rather than diminished. As she tied off the final stitch and began applying antiseptic ointment, Eleanor became aware of a strange sensation, a prickling awareness at the nape of her neck, a feeling of being observed more intently than the routine procedure warranted. She glanced up to find Ben Sullivan studying her face with an expression that went beyond normal patient curiosity. "Have we met before?" he asked, voice low enough that Dr. Callahan, who had stepped away to complete paperwork, couldn't hear. "Outside of Blackridge, I mean." Eleanor shook her head, focusing on securing the bandage over his newly sutured wound. "I don't believe so. I've only lived here since last summer." "You look familiar somehow." His gaze remained fixed on her face, uncomfortably intense. You ever spend time in Bozeman? I was based there before taking this logging contract. No, never been. Eleanor kept her tone pleasantly neutral, while mentally cataloguing the contents of her purse, pepper spray, car keys positioned between fingers if necessary. Mark had taught her wariness the hard way. All done here. Keep the bandage clean and dry for 48 hours, then change it daily. Stitches come out in 10 days if healing progresses normally. Ben nodded, still watching her with that unsettling focus as Dr. Callahan returned with aftercare instructions and a prescription for antibiotics. Eleanor excused herself, washing her hands thoroughly before returning to reception, where Sophie was contentedly sorting colored blocks under Martha's supervision. "Everything go okay?" Martha asked, looking up from her knitting, which she had resumed while monitoring Sophie's play. "Fine, clean wound, good stitches." Eleanor scooped up Sophie, suddenly anxious to be away from the clinic. "We should head home for her nap." Martha's shrewd eyes missed nothing. "Ben Sullivan giving you trouble? He's new in town, bit rough around the edges, but seems decent enough." "No trouble," Eleanor assured her, gathering Sophie's things with forced casualness. "Just reminded me of someone, that's all." The half-truth seemed to satisfy Martha, who returned to her knitting with a nod. Eleanor hurried to her car, securing Sophie in her car seat before sliding behind the wheel. As she pulled away from the clinic, she checked her rearview mirror compulsively, irrational fear prickling along her spine despite the bright spring sunshine. Ben Sullivan couldn't possibly know her from before. She had been careful, changing her name legally from Eleanor Winters to Eleanor Wright after the divorce, using her grandfather's address for all official correspondence, paying cash whenever possible. Even if Mark had somehow tracked her to Montana, he wouldn't have sent a logger rather than coming himself. His controlling nature wouldn't allow proxy confrontation. Still, the encounter had unsettled her, bringing back the hypervigilance she had finally begun to shed after months in Blackridge's peaceful isolation. By the time she reached the cabin, rational thought had reasserted itself. Ben Sullivan was simply one of those people with an overactive recognition system, the type who constantly believed they'd met strangers before. Nothing to worry about. Eleanor went through their afternoon routine with deliberate normalcy. Lunch, nap-time story, quiet work on clinic paperwork while Sophie slept. When the toddler awoke, they ventured outside again, exploring the spring forest surrounding the cabin. Sophie's delight in discovering a family of rabbits beneath a fallen log temporarily banished Eleanor's lingering unease. That night, after tucking Sophie into her crib, Eleanor retrieved her grandfather's journals from their hiding place, beneath a loose floorboard in the cabin's main room. She had read them cover to cover after King Aldric's first appearance, searching for information about the underground kingdom and its inhabitants. Now she returned to them seeking reassurance that her bargain protected Sophie not just from illness, but from all threats, including the possibility, however remote, that Mark might someday find them. James Wright's spidery handwriting filled dozens of leather-bound volumes, chronicling his interactions with the vampire court over 6 decades. Most entries were perfunctory records of silver deliveries and brief observations about changing leadership within the underground kingdom. Occasionally, however, he included more detailed accounts of supernatural interventions in Blackridge's affairs. Eleanor found what she sought in a journal dated 1957, Strange Incident at Miller's General Store today. A man claiming to be Sarah Johnson's ex-husband from Ohio attempted to remove her forcibly from the premises. Before Sheriff Davis could intervene, 2 tourists intercepted the man. They escorted him from town with what Hank Miller described as unnatural persuasiveness. By nightfall, no one could recall the man's appearance or name, though all remembered the incident itself occurring. Monthly delivery completed this evening. Mentioned the disturbance to His Majesty, who merely smiled that unsettling smile of his. "The bargain includes protection, Mr. Wright," he reminded me. "Blackridge and its legitimate residents remain under our care, so long as the agreed-upon tributes continue. I suspect Sarah Johnson's unexpected arrival in Blackridge last winter, her integration into our community, was not coincidental but orchestrated. Another lost soul delivered to this hidden place, another thread in the complex tapestry binding our town to those below." Eleanor closed the journal, relief washing through her. The vampire court protected Blackridge and its residents, a category that now included her and Sophie. Even if Mark somehow tracked them here, supernatural guardians would intervene before he could cause harm. For the first time since fleeing Denver, Eleanor allowed herself to believe they might truly be safe. Eleanor replaced the journals in their hiding place, her earlier unease replaced by grim satisfaction. Let Ben Sullivan stare all he wanted, let Mark search until the end of time. Blackridge held secrets older and more powerful than one abusive ex-husband's rage. She and Sophie were part of those secrets now, bound to the mountain and what dwelled beneath it by blood and covenant. For the first time since King Aldrich had appeared in her doorway during the blizzard, Eleanor felt not just resigned to their situation, but grateful for it. They were not merely survivors anymore, they were protected. The June full moon rose copper-hued over Blackridge. 9 feedings had occurred since the initial bargain. Tonight marked a deviation from the established pattern, a formal invitation on parchment. The court of King Aldrich requests the presence of Eleanor Wright at the summer solstice gathering. Blood tribute will be collected as part of the evening's ceremonial observances. Formal attire required. Eleanor had stared at the invitation with apprehension, public feeding rather than private donation, ceremonial observances instead of clinical procedure. Yet refusing wasn't an option. Martha had agreed to stay with Sophie overnight. Accepting without question Eleanor's explanation about attending a medical conference in Missoula. The elderly woman had become a surrogate grandmother to Sophie, their relationship a blessing Eleanor hadn't anticipated when making her desperate bargain with the Vampire King. Now, dressed in the only formal garment she owned, a midnight blue evening gown purchased for a medical school fundraiser years earlier, Eleanor made her way toward the abandoned mine entrance. The dress felt simultaneously too formal and inadequate for whatever awaited her beneath the mountain. Her hair, normally pulled back in a practical ponytail, fell loose around her shoulders, still damp from her pre-departure shower. The guide waiting wasn't Lilith but a male vampire with silver-streaked black hair and green eyes. "Eleanor Wright," he greeted. "I am Matthias, Royal Chamberlain. You are the first human in 3 centuries invited to a solstice gathering. I wasn't aware. Is there protocol I should know about? You will be seated at His Majesty's table. When the time comes for tribute, you will approach the ceremonial dais. The amount collected will remain consistent with previous donations." Eleanor released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. At least the quantity of blood wouldn't increase, even if the collection method might differ. "Thank you for explaining." The passage to the underground city seemed shorter than during her previous descents, though Eleanor suspected this was due to Matthias's faster pace rather than any actual change in distance. When they emerged into the main cavern, she momentarily forgot her apprehension, stunned by the transformation of the space. Thousands of crystalline lights hung suspended throughout the cavern, casting rainbow refractions across buildings and walkways. Flowering vines that shouldn't have been able to grow without sunlight, draped from balconies and arches, their blossoms luminescent in shades of blue, purple and silver. Music, unlike anything Eleanor had heard above ground, filled the air. Complex harmonies without discernible instruments, vibrations that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. "The solstice gathering celebrates the height of surface world growth," Matthias explained, noting her wonderment. "Though we dwell apart, we remain connected to the cycles above. What flourishes there provides sustenance here, directly or indirectly. Vampires filled the streets, dressed in formal attire that spanned centuries of fashion, everything from what appeared to be authentic Renaissance garments to modern evening wear." They parted before Matthias with deferential nods, many casting curious glances at Eleanor as they passed. Unlike during her previous visits, when hunger had dominated their expressions, tonight she observed primarily curiosity and something approaching respect. The palace had undergone a transformation, its entrance flanked by crystalline sculptures. Inside, surfaces that had previously appeared stone now pulsed with subtle illumination that followed their movement like bioluminescent waves. Matthias led her to a vast circular room. Tiered seating surrounded a central floor, where vampires gathered in small groups. At the far end, an elevated platform supported an ornate table with high-backed chairs, reserved for the court's most important members. "Wait here momentarily," Matthias instructed, leaving Eleanor near the entrance as he approached a female vampire whose elaborate silver headdress suggested significant status. Eleanor remained where instructed, intensely aware of the gazes now fixed upon her, some curious, some assessing, some bearing the familiar hunger she had come to recognize during her monthly visits. She straightened her posture, channeling the professional confidence she projected when dealing with difficult patients at the clinic. Whatever ceremony awaited, she would face it with dignity rather than fear. A subtle shift in the room's energy alerted her before the formal announcement. Conversations paused, postures straightened, attention redirected toward the main entrance where she stood. Matthias reappeared at her side just as trumpets sounded from unseen musicians. His Royal Majesty, King Aldrich, Sovereign of the Mountain Court, Protector of Blackridge, Guardian of the Ancient Compact, a voice proclaimed, echoing throughout the chamber, and his honored human guest, Eleanor Wright, blood tributary and healer. Eleanor barely had time to process the unexpected title of healer before King Aldrich himself appeared beside her, offering his arm with formal precision. Unlike their previous encounters, where his attire had been relatively simple, tonight he wore what could only be described as royal regalia, a fitted jacket of midnight blue velvet embroidered with silver thread, in patterns that matched the crown resting upon his raven hair. "You will accompany me to the high table," he instructed quietly, his obsidian eyes revealing nothing of his thoughts. "The ceremonial tribute will occur after the first course. The remainder of the gathering will not require your participation." Eleanor placed her hand lightly on his offered arm, hyper-aware of the strength beneath the velvet sleeve, of the absolute stillness of a being who did not breathe or produce body heat as humans did. "I wasn't expecting all this. The solstice gathering occurs only once annually. Your scheduled donation coincided fortuitously with our most significant ceremonial occasion." He guided her through the parting crowd, vampires bowing respectfully as they passed. "Your presence serves multiple purposes tonight." "What purposes?" Eleanor asked, keeping her voice equally low as they approached the elevated platform. "Primarily, demonstration of the renewed covenant with the surface world. Your willing tribute symbolizes the continued harmony between our realms." They ascended the platform, where he guided her to a chair at his right hand. "Additionally, formal acknowledgement of your status as something more than mere sustenance. The court has questions about your healing abilities." Eleanor frowned, momentarily forgetting protocol in her confusion. "My healing abilities? I'm a nurse, not a—" "Later," King Aldrich interrupted as they reached the high table. "For now, observe the customs of my court. You will be served food compatible with human consumption. Eat what appeals to you. Drink only from your designated goblet. Speak when addressed directly, otherwise maintain dignified silence." With these instructions delivered, he turned to address the gathered court, raising his hands in a gesture that immediately silenced all conversation. "My loyal subjects, we gather to celebrate the summer solstice, when life above reaches its fullest expression." His voice carried effortlessly throughout the chamber, without apparent amplification. "Tonight, we honor ancient traditions, renew sacred bonds, and welcome the human tributary who represents our continued connection to the world above." Hundreds of vampires raised crystal goblets in synchronized movement. "To the covenant," they intoned as one, the unified voice creating vibrations Eleanor could feel in her bones. "To the covenant," King Aldrich echoed, lifting his own goblet. Eleanor followed suit, raising the ornate silver vessel placed before her. The liquid within wasn't wine as she had expected, but something clearer with an aroma reminiscent of honey and herbs. She sipped cautiously, finding the taste pleasant, sweet without being cloying, warming as it traveled down her throat. Servants appeared silently, delivering platters to the high table first, then to the lower tables arranged throughout the chamber. Eleanor was served what appeared to be normal human food, roasted vegetables arranged in artistic patterns, some kind of game hen with crisp golden skin, bread still steaming from the oven. The vampires, by contrast, received goblets of varying shades of crimson liquid and nothing more. "You maintain food preparation capabilities for human guests?" Eleanor asked softly, genuinely curious despite her nervousness. "We receive occasional human emissaries from other protected territories," King Aldrich replied, watching as she sampled the vegetables. "Diplomatic relations require appropriate hospitality. Additionally, some of our younger court members retain fondness for human food, though it provides no sustenance." Eleanor nodded, forcing herself to eat despite the anxiety fluttering in her stomach. The food was surprisingly delicious, perfectly seasoned, textures complementing one another in ways that suggested a skilled chef rather than perfunctory preparation for a token human guest. As she ate, she observed the court's interactions with anthropological interest. Despite their supernatural nature, the vampires displayed recognizably human social dynamics: deference to authority, conversational groupings that suggested established relationships, subtle competitiveness in attire and demeanor. Had it not been for their unnatural stillness when not actively moving and the contents of their goblets, they might have been mistaken for an eccentric but human aristocracy. The first course concluded with another trumpet flourish. Conversation ceased immediately as King Aldrich rose from his seat, extending his hand toward Eleanor. "It is time," he stated simply. Eleanor set aside her napkin and placed her hand in his, allowing him to guide her from the high table toward the center of the chamber, where a raised circular platform awaited, illuminated by crystalline lights that intensified as they approached. The assembled court watched in silent attention, their collective focus creating an almost physical pressure against Eleanor's consciousness. King Aldrich led her to the center of the platform, then addressed the gathering once more. "For centuries, our existence has depended upon the ancient covenant established with the surface dwellers: blood freely given, not forcibly taken; protection offered, not dominance imposed. Tonight, Eleanor Wright honors this tradition as representative of Blackridge, continuing the legacy established by her ancestor." Eleanor stood very still as he turned to face her, suddenly conscious of how the lighting transformed his features, accentuating the inhuman perfection of his bone structure, the depthless quality of his eyes, the subtle points of elongated canines now visible behind his lips. "Your tribute sustains not merely your king, but the covenant itself," he continued, his voice pitched for her alone despite the attentive audience. "What is freely offered carries power beyond mere sustenance." Without further preamble, he took her hand in his, turning it palm upward with deliberate grace. Unlike their private feeding sessions, where he had always taken blood from her wrist, he now raised her palm to his lips. Before Eleanor could process this deviation from established procedure, he bit into the fleshy base of her thumb, a location rich with blood vessels but rarely used for medical draws due to its sensitivity. Pain flared hot and immediate, more intense than the wrist feedings had been. Eleanor fought to maintain her composure, aware of hundreds of eyes fixed upon their joined hands, as King Aldrich drew sustenance from the unusual location. The familiar lightheadedness followed swiftly, intensified by her upright position and the charged atmosphere of the ceremonial gathering. Just when Eleanor feared her legs might buckle, King Aldrich withdrew. He raised her hand, displaying the wound to the court. "Freely given," he proclaimed, "covenant renewed." The court rose as one, bowing toward Eleanor, recognition of her sacrifice, acknowledgement of her role in maintaining whatever balance existed between their worlds. King Aldrich lowered her hand, producing a silk handkerchief from within his jacket and pressing it gently against the wound. "The ceremonial portion is complete," he informed her quietly. "You may return to your seat or withdraw to a private chamber if you require recovery time." Eleanor assessed her physical state with clinical detachment, light-headed but not dangerously so, vision clear though colors seemed unnaturally vivid, legs unsteady but capable of supporting her weight with concentration. "I can return to the table," she decided, unwilling to display weakness before this gathering of predators, regardless of their current respect. King Aldrich nodded approvingly, offering his arm once more to escort her from the platform. As they made their way back to the high table, vampires inclined their heads respectfully as she passed, a striking difference from the hungry assessment she had received upon arrival. Once seated, A servant immediately appeared with the same honey herb beverage she had been served earlier, along with a small plate of what appeared to be dark chocolate and dried fruits. "For blood sugar restoration," King Aldrich explained, noting her questioning glance at the offerings. "The ceremonial drawing is more taxing than clinical extraction, though the volume remains consistent." Eleanor sipped the beverage gratefully, feeling its warmth spread through her system, counteracting the chill that had settled into her extremities during the ceremony. "You called me healer in the introduction," she observed, after regaining some equilibrium. "And mentioned my healing abilities. I don't understand." King Aldrich studied her with scientific curiosity. "Your blood contains properties we have not encountered in human tributaries for generations. Accelerated healing factors, immune response modulators. Lilith observed this during analysis." Eleanor blinked. "You analyze the blood you take?" "Of course. We may be supernatural by your standards, but we are not without scientific methodology." The implications slowly crystallized in Eleanor's mind. "You're using my blood for medical purposes within your court." "With remarkable success," he confirmed, "hence the formal acknowledgement of your status as healer rather than merely tributary. It is a position of significant honor." "Does this change our agreement?" she asked finally, direct as always. "The terms remain unaltered. 3 nights each month, blood freely given, Sophie's continued health and safety guaranteed." King Aldrich studied her with that same scientific interest. "However, your elevated status within the court provides certain benefits. Protection beyond the standard offered to Blackridge residents. Priority consideration should you require supernatural intervention. Access to knowledge typically restricted from human awareness." "In exchange for what?" Eleanor pressed, experience with supernatural bargains having taught her caution. "There's always an exchange." The faintest suggestion of a smile touched King Aldrich's lips. "Perceptive. Indeed, we would request occasional consultation on medical matters beyond simple blood donation. Your nursing expertise, combined with your unique biochemistry, represents a valuable resource." "Consultation," Eleanor repeated, testing the word's implications. "Not additional blood drawing." "Precisely. Knowledge exchange only, perhaps twice yearly, for matters of particular complexity." His obsidian eyes revealed nothing of his thoughts as he added, "Such service would be compensated appropriately. Reduced donation frequency, perhaps, as you suggested during our initial discussion of expanded arrangements." Eleanor considered the proposal carefully, aware that agreements with supernatural entities required precise understanding of terms. 2 consultations annually, in exchange for reducing my monthly donations from 3 nights to 2 nights. Acceptable." King Aldrich agreed without hesitation. "Beginning after tonight's ceremonial tribute," Eleanor nodded slowly, aware that she had just negotiated a significant improvement in their arrangement, 1/3 reduction in blood donation frequency in exchange for medical knowledge she would likely have shared freely if asked. Either King Aldrich valued her expertise more highly than she had anticipated, or there were aspects to this new arrangement she didn't yet comprehend. Before she could pursue this line of thought further, Matthias appeared at the king's left side, bending to whisper something in his ear. King Aldrich's expression changed subtly, something flashing behind his eyes that Eleanor couldn't interpret. "It appears our gathering will include unexpected entertainment," he remarked, gesturing toward the chamber's main entrance where a disturbance had broken out. "A human interloper has breached our outer defenses." Eleanor turned toward the commotion, blood freezing in her veins, as guards dragged a struggling figure into the ceremonial chamber. Even at this distance, even through her post-donation lightheadedness, recognition struck with the force of physical blow. Mark, her ex-husband, the man she had fled across state lines to escape. "How is this possible?" she whispered, gripping the table edge as vertigo threatened to overwhelm her. "He can't be here. He can't have found me." King Aldrich observed her reaction with sharp attention. "You know this trespasser." It wasn't a question, but Eleanor nodded anyway, forcing words past the constriction in her throat. "My ex-husband, Sophie's father, he's dangerous, violent, that's why I came to Blackridge." Understanding dawned in the Vampire King's expression. "Ah, the true reason for your grandfather's cabin. Not coincidental timing after all." He signaled to Matthias, who immediately approached the guards restraining Mark. This development is unexpected, but not unwelcome. Your bargain includes protection, Eleanor Wright. Tonight you will witness the fulfillment of that aspect of our covenant. Eleanor could only watch, paralyzed by colliding emotions, as the guards forced Mark to his knees before the high table. He looked exactly as she remembered, broad-shouldered and conventionally handsome, features that had once charmed her now contorted with rage. His expensive clothing was torn and dirty, suggesting a difficult journey to this hidden place. "Release me!" Mark shouted, struggling against the vampire's supernatural strength. "I know she's here! Eleanor, show yourself, you bitch!" His voice, that voice that had haunted her nightmares for months after her escape, shattered the paralysis gripping Eleanor. She rose from her seat, stepping forward to stand beside King Aldric's chair. "I'm here, Mark," she stated, her voice steadier than she would have believed possible. "How did you find me?" Mark's eyes widened, fury momentarily displaced by shock at her formal attire, her position at what was clearly a place of honor. "That fucking logger," he spat, resuming his struggles against the impassive guards. "Sullivan, recognized you from the photos I circulated. Been tracking you for months, followed you tonight." His gaze darted around the ceremonial chamber, taking in the assembled vampires with growing comprehension and horror. "What the hell is this place? What have you gotten yourself into?" "A protected sanctuary," Eleanor answered simply. "Somewhere you can't hurt us anymore." King Aldric rose beside her, power radiating from his very presence as he addressed the kneeling intruder. "Mark Winters, you have violated sovereign territory, threatened a protected resident of Blackridge, and interrupted a sacred ceremony." His voice carried the weight of centuries, of authority beyond human reckoning. "By ancient law, your fate now rests with the one you sought to harm." He turned to Eleanor, his expression grave yet somehow expectant. "The covenant grants you the right of judgment, Eleanor Wright. This man's life and memory are yours to determine." Eleanor looked from Mark's desperate face to King Aldric's impassive one. The weight of judgment pressed against her, the ability to permanently end the threat Mark posed, balanced against the moral implications. "He deserves punishment," she said, "but not death. Take his memories of finding me. Remove all knowledge of Blackridge. Return him to Denver with the conviction that Sophie and I have left the country." King Aldric studied her for a long moment, his ancient eyes unreadable. Then he inclined his head slightly. "A merciful judgment. It shall be done as you request." Mark renewed his struggles as the Vampire King approached, comprehension of his fate dawning in his panicked expression. "No, you can't do this. Eleanor, stop them. I have rights. I'm her father." "A father protects," Eleanor responded, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "A father loves. You did neither. Goodbye, Mark." She watched with strange detachment as King Aldric placed his hands on either side of Mark's head, ignoring his continued protests. The Vampire King spoke words in that ancient language Eleanor had heard during Sophie's healing, power vibrating through the air as Mark's struggles gradually ceased, his eyes growing unfocused, then vacant. When King Aldric released him, Mark slumped forward, consciousness apparently fleeing alongside the extracted memories. The guards maintained their hold on his limp form, awaiting further instructions. "It is done," King Aldric announced, returning to Eleanor's side. "He will awaken in Denver with implanted memories of a futile international search. The compulsion against pursuing you further will hold for his natural lifetime." Relief washed through Eleanor, so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. Mark couldn't hurt them anymore, couldn't threaten Sophie's safety or Eleanor's hard-won peace. The nightmare that had driven her to Blackridge had ended, not through violence but through supernatural intervention that left even her tormentor physically unharmed. "Thank you," she whispered, the words wholly inadequate for the gift of safety she had just received. King Aldric acknowledged her gratitude with a slight inclination of his head. "The covenant includes protection, Eleanor Wright. Tonight's events merely fulfilled that aspect of our agreement." He gestured to the guards. "Remove this human from our realm. Ensure his return to Denver with appropriate implanted context for his current location and condition." As the guards dragged Mark's unconscious form from the ceremonial chamber, the gathered vampires gradually resumed their conversations, The interruption apparently considered concluded. King Aldrich guided Eleanor back to her seat, where fresh honey-herb beverage awaited. "Drink," he instructed. "The combined effects of blood donation and emotional strain require replenishment." Eleanor complied gratefully, allowing the warm liquid to combat the chill that had settled into her bones. The reality of what had just occurred, Mark finding her, the supernatural judgment, the permanent resolution of the threat he posed, seemed simultaneously dreamlike and hyper-real, each detail etched into her consciousness with unnatural clarity. "How did he breach your defenses?" she asked after regaining some equilibrium. "You said Blackridge was protected." "An unforeseen vulnerability," King Aldrich admitted, his expression suggesting this breach troubled him significantly. "The logger Sullivan should have been identified as a potential threat upon arrival in Blackridge. His connection to your former husband should have been detected. Our watchers have grown complacent after decades without serious threats to the Covenant." "He won't remember any of this," Eleanor clarified, needing absolute certainty. "Mark won't remember the underground city, the vampires, the ceremony." "Nothing of this night will remain in his consciousness," King Aldrich confirmed. "The memory extraction was complete. Even should he encounter supernatural suggestion in the future, these specific memories cannot be recovered." Eleanor nodded, relief settling deeper into her bones. For the first time since fleeing Denver, she could truly believe in their safety. Not just temporary hiding, but permanent freedom from the threat Mark had represented. "The remainder of the gathering does not require your participation," King Aldrich informed her, noting her continuing pallor and obvious exhaustion. "Lilith will escort you to the surface when you feel capable of the journey. Your monthly obligation has been fulfilled through the ceremonial tribute." Eleanor recognized the dismissal for what it was, consideration for her human limitations rather than rejection. "Thank you for your protection tonight," she said formally, rising from her seat. "And for the honor of attending your ceremony." King Aldrich acknowledged her words with a regal inclination of his head, already turning his attention back to court matters as Lilith appeared at Eleanor's side to guide her from the high table. As Eleanor followed the vampire seneschal through the winding palace corridors, exhaustion competed with euphoria in her consciousness. The evening had transformed her understanding of her bargain with the vampire court, not merely blood donation in exchange for Sophie's health, but a complex covenant that included protection, status, and now reduced obligations through her medical consultation agreement. Most importantly, the threat that had driven her to Blackridge had been permanently neutralized. Mark would never find them, never threaten Sophie's safety or Eleanor's hard-won peace. The price of 3 blood donations monthly had just been reduced to 2, with the added security of knowing her sacrifice served healing purposes within the vampire court rather than mere sustenance. Eleanor emerged from the hidden mine entrance into the summer night, the full moon now high overhead illuminating the forest path leading back to her cabin. Martha would be asleep in the guest room, Sophie secure in her crib, unaware of how significantly their future had changed this night. For the first time since making her desperate bargain with the Vampire King during that terrible blizzard, Eleanor felt not just resignation, but genuine acceptance of their new reality. The blood price was steep but fair exchange for what they had received: Sophie's life, their safety, and now freedom from the fear that had shadowed them since their escape from Denver. As she made her way through the moonlit forest, Eleanor acknowledged the truth forming in her consciousness. Blackridge was home now, not a temporary hiding place, but where Sophie would grow up, where Eleanor would build a life incorporating both the human world and the vampire kingdom below. By the time she reached the cabin, decision had crystallized into certainty. They would stay permanently within the protection of the Covenant. Sophie would grow up knowing nothing of her father's violence or the supernatural arrangement that had saved her life. And when Sophie turned 18, when the final clause of Eleanor's bargain came due and her daughter faced 1 year of service in the vampire court, Eleanor would ensure she was prepared, not with fear or resentment, but with understanding of the complex symbiosis between the two worlds that had preserved her life. For now, though, there was only this moment, moonlight streaming through cabin windows, a healthy child sleeping peacefully, and a mother whose blood sacrifice had purchased miracles beyond ordinary human reckoning. Whatever the future held, Helena would face it with the same determination that had driven her to offer her lifeblood to a vampire king during a blizzard. When her daughter's life hung in the balance and impossible choices became the only ones that mattered.